Textiles are part of our history. Find a period in time, and not only will you find the cloth that people wore, but also the crafting of threads and how people used it to embellish their lives. Today's guest, Shaunna Edwards, is the co-author of the book, The Thread Collectors, a book about two women during the American Civil War. It's a story of determination, war, loss, friendship, survival, and love. And I was so happy when Shaunna sat down with me to tell us all about how the book came to be. So grab your sewing and a cup of tea, and here's my interview with Shaunna Edwards. So welcome, Shaunna, to the show. Where in the world are you coming to us from?
Thank you, Karen. Today I am sitting in Manhattan in New York. Usually I live in Harlem, New York, but I'm originally from New Orleans, Louisiana.
So what brought you to so far north?
Law school back in 2000, which feels like when you used to say 2000, it sounded like we were going to have flying cars, but now you're like, that was 24 years ago. So I, like many novelists, I'm a reformed lawyer. I think every lawyer has a book that they're writing that's hanging out in their top drawer that they pull it out every now and then. And so I came to New York for law school.
Well, you went to school for literature and law, and now you're working in diversity, inclusion, and equity. When in the world do you have time to write a book?
Well, this book was conceived by me and my co-author, Allison Richmond. We had started chatting about it in 2017. She had originally been inspired to think of a Civil War novel because she had this great story of great uncles fighting on the opposite side of the Civil War. Even more interestingly, she's a Jewish woman, so you can imagine how rare that was. I started embroidering, literal pun intended, the idea of this story also involving a Black couple, but we just kind of left it to the side. In 2020, when we were at the height of the pandemic, and of course, the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, we came together. So I think that, like many people in the pandemic, it was difficult because you experience this isolation, this loneliness, but at the same time, I think time really started to matter and what you did with your time. And I wanted to be intentional. If we weren't going to be running around and meeting people for dinners, I wanted to take the extra time that I had and put it into something really creative and, frankly, hopefully inspiring and light inducing in a time that felt really dark. So in my day-to-day life, and I had a newborn, well, I had a baby 5 months ago, I don't have any time. But during the pandemic, I think I taught myself that you really can make time for a labor of love.
You're working with Allison and you're fleshing out this story. When did the idea of thread collecting come into it?
So almost immediately, from my perspective, when she first, Allison is a working author. You know, she has a new book launching today. I'm going to say a little plug for her called Timekeepers. And she, in the course of our friendship, would often present these story ideas to me. I'm a voracious reader. She would say, "Are you interested?" So her original concept was about two men, one Black and formerly enslaved, and one white, meeting on the battlefield, and maybe a map being created of sorts, because that was very common during the Civil War. And it was almost like a flash in my mind. I saw a woman, a Black woman, sewing by candlelight, and she was sewing the map. And I mentioned that to her. I was like, well, if he's probably not going to create a map the kind that we're used to, because he probably would have been illiterate in the antebellum period, it was illegal to teach an enslaved person how to read or write. So it's not going to be a map that says turn left at the tree, right? What would a visual map look like? And I am from a family of farmers. My mother was born on a cotton farm in Northwest Louisiana. I always say, don't bother looking up the town of Houston. It is unincorporated. I think there are about 300 people there. But her ancestresses, they made quilts, right? They took things and they would make these beautiful quilts and they would embroider on top of them. And this idea of you didn't have much, but maybe you had a scrap, has always been in my mind and was kind of passed down. So I saw this woman, this Black woman, taking what she had and kind of using the resources, the limited resources at her disposal to help other people. So I mentioned this idea. It was fully formed as a theme, but obviously not as a novel, to Allison. And she said, ooh, that's intriguing, because it was something not from her culture and maybe not something that she had been previously aware of.
Well, I think it's so interesting. I was just interviewed a woman who makes map quilts, like
Oh
actually
my
makes
gosh,
big
wait,
map
I
quilts.
need to know this woman.
And every time there's a map quilt done, I just find them so fascinating. And especially now with so many fiber arts behind people and
Hmm.
different techniques that they can pull upon, and how you see the world from a bird's eye view as opposed from a three-dimensional view. And what do you write down and what do you remember? When William writes his map and he's
Hmm.
desperately trying to save it, I saw those elements really come out. Like, here's a tree. I don't know how to write, but I can draw a
I
little
can
picture of a tree.
absolutely. And in a way, doesn't that also feel like memory as well? We can all be existing in the same place, but what comes to the forefront for us is very different, you know, and I think in a way that was something else we were trying to set forward. We're all traveling through these same events, and sometimes they're cataclysmic, like war, but the things that are happening to us and the impact of them is not the same. It's not relative at all. We are all living our own personal tragedy and all living our own personal greatest joy, but we have to recognize that people are moving through the same event very, very differently. In a way, that's kind of like a personal map.
Another map.
Another
Lucy.
map, another map.
Now, did any of your family history make it into the novel?
Yes, first of all, I would say that in general, the idea of creativity and art is embedded in me, not only because of the story that I told about my mother coming from women who made quilts, but also my parents 30 years ago opened an art gallery specializing only in art of the African diaspora. So I've been introduced to quilting from two ends of the spectrum. I would say the humble quilts that I grew up with, but also at the same time, you know, my mother taking me to museums and showing me fiber artists such as like Faith Ringgold. And now you see amazing people like Bisa Butler, people who are really suddenly taking this craft that's been women's work and often poor women's work and making it worthy to hang in museums. So I would say just the very idea of art being made from threads is part of my family history. We also have a matriarch in the book. Her name is Janie. Janie is inspired by my great, great, great aunt, Janie Roach. And Janie was a formidable woman, even though she was a Black woman at the time when Black women's options were very limited. She became financially independent. She became a landowner. I always heard that the family was quite angry at her because when she would loan money, she would charge interest, like any good businesswoman. So some of the, I don't want to say harshness, but some of the practicality of the matriarch Janie in our novel is inspired by my great, great, great aunt Janie Roach. Stella is my mother's name as well. So a little bit of Stella came in there. And then also my mother had an extended branch cousin whose name was Amine as well. And so Amine in the novel is inspired by my mother's relative as well. So all of those people are from my matrilineal line. Obviously, it's not a true to life depiction of them, but I took little parts of all of the different stories that I've heard and we wove them into the novel.
I thought you did a really good job of a balance of women living on the street. Like, they weren't perfect, they
Hmm.
weren't angelic, like they were truly multidimensional, and how when times get tough, people will pull together.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. You know, it's interesting because when we first started discussing our main Black heroine, Stella, and really contrasting her with our white Jewish heroine, Lily, we had to really think about this idea that Stella is enslaved and she's essentially kept in concubinage, and how you do that appropriately without being voyeuristic of pain by also acknowledging the fact that that was a part of enslavement as well, but also to give her some agency, right? She doesn't necessarily have agency over her body, but then at the same time, we see her kind of her subversion and like gathering these threads and making these maps. And I think for the women of Rampart Street, for half a second, we were joking that that should be the title of the book, The Women of Rampart Street, many of them who are in similar situations, right? They don't necessarily have agency over their body or their ultimate fate, but they are expressing themselves, right? They are showing community. They are moving past some of the bitterness of the situation. And when the women of Rampart Street come together to make a quilt for Stella, that is very much what we were trying to say, right? Like, I don't have everything in the world to give you, but what I can give you, I'm willing to give and stitch it with what someone else is going to give you. And together, that will be, our gift. And I often think that as women, we're so stretched, right? Everything seems to be falling on us. Maybe I just feel like that because it's my first week back in work. But maybe it's not about being able to cover someone completely, but maybe it's just about like, I can give a square or I can give a triangle and we can come together as a community.
Yeah, and that outward anger is not anger at you. It's just anger
At the
because it's the
situation.
only thing holding you up.
Exactly. Exactly. That's a really good way to say it. It's the only thing that's holding you up sometimes.
Now, normally in women's fiction, there's always these long, very descriptive passages about their clothing and what they're wearing. But you didn't do that in this novel. Was that a conscious choice?
Allison and I always wanted to write a beautiful novel that puts you in the place of your characters. But I don't think it's necessary to do that by saying, and the buttons were brass. Like those things are great. And like sometimes I read those types of novels, but this was more about the emotion, the resilience, the relationships, as opposed to, and her petticoat had 3 inches of lace. We also have to remember it's wartime. So at a certain point, you're going to run out of clothes, just like Stella runs out of threads. There's not much more to say. I will tell you a funny story because, I'm a novice in this world of publishing, although not anymore. I did not really understand the cover making process. I kind of thought that authors, had an idea, and I don't know why I would have thought this. Editors and publisher housing were like, yes, of course, you're a genius, go with it. Not at all how it works. So when the first covers came back, and I'm thrilled with it, by the way, I wondered why they kept cutting off the heads of the women, which you see a lot, particularly in historical fiction geared towards women. And they told me it's because people want to see themselves on the cover, like they don't want it to have a face. But I really just thought a lot about what it means that we're so willing to decapitate women on the cover of novels. But
Well, the other angle is the back of a woman
the back of a woman, exactly.
walking away. You never see the face.
Just as long as there's no face. But when it comes to clothing, one thing that Allison and I immediately noted, and if those of you have the book, you can look at it, is that the Black heroine is wearing a much more ornate dress than our white heroine. And we wondered for a second, we was like, does this make sense? And actually, a costume historian very, I would say, diplomatically explained to us that yes, it absolutely did make sense. What you found at the time was Northern women would wear clothing of better quality. The cloth was of better quality, but it had less embellishment, darker colors. Whereas a woman in Stella's position, because of, frankly, the ornamental purpose that she served, she would have a dress that was of less good quality cloth, but it would have more embellishment. So that big lace, all of that would be period appropriate.
Well, that's a lot of information to learn. How much did you have to dig in and do research to flesh out this novel?
So much. I think that for writers, I think imagination is key. But then I also think if you're going to purport to write historical fiction, it needs to be rooted in some kind of history. So Allison and I did a ton of research. I was privileged enough to sometimes go and visit my mother during the height of the pandemic, which meant that I could be on the ground. I went to Port Hudson, which plays a seminal part in the plot. I worked with the Historic New Orleans collection. I worked with the Amistad Foundation. I read letters, it was odd, I read them with my bare hands of soldiers writing home about the fact that they were annoyed because there wasn't going to be a Mardi Gras celebration because it was the height of Civil War and they had really been looking forward to the parties. So we really tried to embed ourselves in the situation. One thing is we did not find any real life examples of someone embroidering maps on these little pieces of cloth in order to help enslaved people run away. But we did find examples of Civil War spies, spy mistresses, I guess you could call them, that would make little notations on their petticoats in thread, like with little different symbols. So we thought that that was really interesting.
That is interesting.
Absolutely, because they knew that that's not where they were going to be searched at the time.
Now, I just read another book written by two authors, The Personal Librarian
Hmm.
by Victoria Christopher Murray, and who's the other person? Mary Benedict. Is this a trend now? Two people writing together to make sure the stories are told well?
So you're seeing more collaboration. I think it's an interesting trend. One of my favorite newer authors, Christine Pride, she's written, I think, now 3 books with Joe Piazza, and I think it's also interesting because they are one woman is a Black woman and one woman's a white woman, and their first book really tackled the issue of race as well. I don't know that I will say that it's like something we're going to see all the time because it's not easy. I think you have to have a lot of trust in the relationship. Writing a novel is one of the more personal things I think that anyone can embark upon. It's an artistic endeavor, and many of the people listening probably consider themselves artists and creative. And you are constantly kind of negotiating what your baby is going to look like. And that needs a real relationship. Allison and I were working on the basis of a decade's worth of friendship, which really allowed us to have real conversations. We could have a spirited conversation about a single word, and we have had a spirited conversation about a single word. And I think in this case, it worked out well. I think where you might find in the future to be less successful, if it starts to become like the 90s version of putting a boy band together, you just find 2 authors and you stick them together and you hope for magic. I think it might happen sometimes, but then sometimes it might feel a little bit forced. I think what we're also going to see more of, just because it's an easier way for collaboration to happen, is I'm going to write this chapter from this perspective. You write this chapter from this perspective. So Karen and Shaunna are back and forth. Karen, Shaunna, Karen, Shaunna. Allison and I were really emphatic from the beginning. We didn't want our novel to have that kind of structure because we were talking about the Civil War, a time where there had been so much division. We didn't think that that would embody the spirit of what we were trying to do, which to build connections and find commonality. But I can also see how that might be effective in another novel. Allison and I are tinkering with something now, and I can't say it will necessarily be in a single voice.
So, are you a maker?
No, I cannot say that I am. I have started more tangible art projects. They never match what is in my mind. I think the only thing that I am capable of doing, I can make the words on the paper, and I can generally make the words that come out of my mouth match what is going on in my head, but my hands just don't seem to be able to do the same thing. And I've tried a number of different things, right? Like I've started a quilt, I've tried to take up painting. I actually took harp lessons for a decade. That's why Lily in the novel is a harpist. But I would say that writing is probably the nearest I get to fulfilling my inner creative spirit. But I'm a buyer of makers, if that helps.
So, you sent me a photo of you and your mother. It looks like standing in front of this beautiful old armoire. Tell me about what's inside.
Yes, that is what my mom refers to as the textile closet. She is also a buyer of makers, but the row behind our heads, and my mother, once again, her name is Stella, just like our heroine, are our family quilts. And the oldest one in there is so old that you can still feel the cotton seeds in the batting because it wasn't ginned cotton. I think what's interesting to me about that beautiful armoire and all of those textiles is I'm from New Orleans and I live in the part of New Orleans where we got 12 feet of water. So everything was underwater, including that armoire and all of those beautiful textiles. And when my parents went back to the home 6 weeks after they had drained everything, my mom wasn't just concerned about saving the art collection. The grand piano was a bust, figuring out how to like save pots and pans and all of that. She was really looking for her heirlooms, which were quilts. She did not come from much. And every single one of those quilts behind our head, she found, she took it to the cleaners. She had it restored as much as possible. She rolled it back up and she put it there to ride through the next hurricane. And I think that particularly when we're thinking about things that are handicrafts and we just get, you know, unfortunately, a loved one passes away. We just get things and we don't necessarily give them the value that we should until they are in peril, you know, of no longer existing. I don't have in my life anymore the women that made those quilts. So those quilts are the closest thing that I have to come to them. And I'm just so grateful that at that time of great tragedy, my mother had the foresight. She's an incredibly brilliant woman to treat those quilts with the same care and reverence that she treated other things that might have had far more monetary value. So that is the textile. And now on the bottom, we have tons of textile. My mom is a big traveler. We're always buying things. Like my husband laughs because my view is my motto is basically like, if you want one, buy 10, because are you ever going to be back there again?
Well, collecting textiles and using textiles are
Mhm.
two totally different hobbies.
Yes, yes, but you know what? My mother can make a hell of a tablescape in a pinch, you know? So there's no theme for which she cannot meet the need.
So these quilts that had to be restored, was there any special thing that she did to them other than lay them out to dry? She had them dry cleaned. Does she now wrap them a special way in case it happens
So
again?
we
Or
we wrap them in acid-free paper, which my mother has taught me is something that everyone should have around if they want to preserve things. We wrap them from the inside out, so there's the acid-free paper in the middle. We roll them pretty carefully, trying to be careful of the seams, and we usually tie them with like a ribbon or twine, and then we stack them up like that, I guess like almost like little bales of hay on their special shelf. We try not to let them get too much sunlight. I mean, we don't want to, you know, the fabric is old, the colors are starting to fade. We try to keep them quite preserved, but we take them out to look at them and we take them out on occasions we will want to use them for decoration. So hopefully that helps.
well, just another thought here. You've got this quilt, this legacy to preserve, but the fabrics that are in that quilt are probably so much older.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And tell me about this pink one.
So that is in my bathroom here in New York. My mother took one of her favorite quilts, and it's made of my grandmother's church dresses and my great grandmother's field dresses and like dresses that she would wear into town. And she cut it up and she gave a piece to each of her three daughters. I don't think my brother has a piece. He might have a piece, but I haven't seen it hanging anywhere in his apartment, which is perfectly fine. And you know what, I should ask her, and I'm not sure if that one she felt like the backing couldn't be restored, but it's just the facing of it. And I have it in my bathroom. I'm lucky enough that I don't share a bathroom with my husband. I rather insisted on it because I need my space. And for me, it's something that I like to look at in the morning before I put on, I call my makeup my armor. Before I go out into the world, I just like to look at this piece and it just reminds me of the strength of the women that I came from. I'm like, they went through all that. Whatever happens to you today, it's going to be fine. But I love having that in my bathroom. It's what I see almost first thing in the morning.
And the other one looks like almost a wedding or an anniversary quilt.
It is, you know, the thing about quilting in my family, it's been a way to preserve pieces of people that are gone. My mother is friends and has represented another fiber artist, Phyllis Stevens, who is a wonderful quilt maker. And she did a whole series called Tied to Love, made out of my father's old ties. He passed away in 2013. And when he passed away, he left a legacy of over 400 ties. He was known later in life, he was the bow tie guy. So you can see fabric is kind of a thing. He was the bow tie guy, but before he had done the long ties. And she took all of these ties and she did a whole series. There was even a quilt, and unfortunately, I couldn't find the picture, that is made of my father's old ties, but it is based on my parents' wedding picture. And I just thought it was a beautiful reminder of taking fabric that we love and then incorporating it once again and repurposing it into a beautiful quilt that you can see every day. You can hang on the wall, you can put it on your bed. And I love that thought. She asked my mother's permission, of course, but it wasn't an idea that my mother had had. It was this genius artist seeing the potential of these ties. So if it sparks some, you know, creativity for any of your listeners and they're like, oh, who's wearing ties anymore, right? We're in the new athleisure, everybody's wearing yoga pants to work. You might as well put the ties to good use.
That is beautiful. I
Hmm.
didn't realize that until you told me that they were ties.
They're ties, yeah.
Just the colors, the way that they pop out. Very well done.
Hmm.
So, do you speak to guilds, or do you have a lecture that you give on your book at all?
So we've spoken to a lot of groups across the country, which has been lovely. We have had a lot of support from the Jewish Book Council, which we appreciate. We've spoken to women's organizations. We were the women's history speaker for the Principal Foundation. We've spoken to book clubs, groups of people that are just interested in handicrafts generally, people that are just interested in the Civil War, frankly. And I think for us, the spirit of friendship and commonality and shared purpose is important. I don't want to say it's more important than selling a book, but for us, it was really about cementing a legacy of friendship between us. And so we continue to speak to people and we continue to want to speak to people.
So, if people want to get a hold of you, how do they find you?
On Instagram, because that's the thing, as the kids say, I'm Shaunna J Edwards. That's ShaunnaJedwards. I'm also on Facebook because I got gray hair. You wouldn't know it. I'm Shaunna J Edwards on Facebook as well.
And if they want to purchase your book, where do they find that?
Well, we love independent bookstores, so you can always go to bookshop.org. It's called The Thread Collectors by Shaunna J Edwards and Allison Richmond. But of course, if you like the big boxes as well, we welcome those sales as well. But it's basically available in most of your outlets. We have an audio version, and it was really, really beautifully narrated by Robin Miles. She actually received an audiophile award for her interpretation of the text. So you can get it on audiobook platforms as well. Once again, if you like the big box ones, that's great too.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It's been really interesting getting to know you and the background of this wonderful story.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate being here.
I hope you've enjoyed my interview with Shaunna Edwards. Don't you just love when you know more about the how and why behind a good book? I also love seeing her mother's quilting wardrobe with the legacy shelf. If you want to get your own copy of The Thread Collectors, I will leave a link to it in the video notes below. I will also leave a link to Shaunna's website and her contact info. Next time you're in your sewing room, have Karen's Quilt Circle playing in the background. I have interviewed so many interesting people on this show. Let one inspire you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.